Now, out of an abundance of caution, I need to give you a trigger warning. What you're about to hear will shock you. Are you ready? Well, today, I found myself agreeing with a Greens politician. The horror. And it wasn't just any Green politician. I'm actually agreeing with the most objectionable, the most unreasonable, and the most irrational one. From my perspective, she's the worst of a very bad bunch. Her name is Lydia Thorpe, and she's a senator, and she seems to hate Australia and our way of life. Actually, she claims not to even identify as Australian, but I bet she's got an Aussie passport.
Well, I don't identify as being Australian. It's a concept that's been imposed upon our people since we were invaded.
By my lot?
Yes. The colonisers came and set up the colony, which they now call Australia. Mass genocide occurred.
And despite not identifying as an Australian, which of course you're allowed to identify as anything these days, she swore allegiance to the Queen, probably so she could collect her $20,000 a month salary funded by Aussie taxpayers. I'm sure you'll understand that principle only goes so far after all. Now, of course, I disagree with her on all of that and the other bile she sprouts. But she made a reasonable point in Senate estimates recently when she questioned why taxpayers are funding multinational corporations to employ Aboriginal Australians. At least $91 million has been allocated to 10 of Australia's biggest companies, including Crown, Wesfarmers, Woolworths, Fortescue Metals and others, under a scheme called the Employment Parity Initiative. Now, in return for all of that money, each company agreed to place Indigenous employees and retain them in jobs for at least 26 weeks. Thorpe asked a reasonable question, stating that given these companies have billions and billions of dollars in revenue, why do they need money from the Indigenous Advancement Strategy? And of course she pointed out, correctly, billion-dollar companies don't need government funds or taxpayer funds to employ Aboriginal people. You see, that's where I agree with her. But from there we part ways. She wants the money, that $91 million and plus some, thrown directly into Aboriginal communities, as if there wasn't enough tossed that way already. It's something like $30 billion per year, and that's just the federal cash. You see, the Aboriginal industry in this country has emerged, and everyone, or it seems like almost everyone, is looking for a handout. The politicians, the corporates, the individuals, and the communities themselves. And while Thorpe is right to question subsidising multi-billion-dollar companies, we, that's you and me, taxpayers, continue to subsidise Aboriginal groups and councils that also have assets measured in the billions. The expenditure demands run through almost every element of our society. Local councils are being asked to pay to use Aboriginal words on street or building names. I've been told the going rate is $500 per word per year. And it seems that every official event has a welcome to country or a smoking ceremony or something similar. And I was told today that each one in Parliament House, for example, can cost as much as $5,000. And of course, if you refuse to participate in this gouging, the result is inevitably accusations of racism, as can almost any other perceived slight, actually. We saw as much today when a Neighbours actor, Sharina Clanton, claimed her, quote, virtue signalling workplace was a culturally unsafe place. And she went on to call out the language and behaviour she encountered on the show, saying it often left me ostracised and further marginalised. Well, I'm delighted that she's gone public with these outrageous claims, which Neighbours denies, of course, at the conclusion of her 6-week contract. But in a devastating attack, and I mean devastating, Ms. Clanton accused the show's producers of virtue signalling without action. Oh, the horror. Imagine that. An individual or an organisation virtue signalling without action. How humiliating it must be to be accused of that. But surely Ms. Clanton could have levelled that accusation at almost every virtue signalling major corporate CEO or the pathetic keyboard warriors on Twitter. I mean, there must be thousands of organisations, including a lot of Aboriginal organisations, I should point out, who posture in public while doing very little, if anything, unless someone else is actually paying for it. And while we're at it, what about the hundreds of billions of dollars, taxpayer dollars, thrown at Aboriginal communities to close the gap? And there's nothing, or virtually nothing, to show for it. Is that virtue signalling without action too? Now, we know that some of these communities are rife with drugs, with domestic violence, with sexual abuse, with child rape and other crimes. It's appalling. And some of the loudest virtue signallers, especially in political parties like the Greens, conveniently ignore these inconvenient truths while persistently peddling false narratives. There are a few brave souls prepared to challenge the zeitgeist, including a chap named Anthony Dillon, who wrote a column in the Age newspaper today. Dillon called out the virtue signalling. Thorpe, who makes claims of a deeply racist system, being responsible for Aboriginal deaths in custody. Now, he pointed out, she provides no evidence for her claims, but, and I quote, and I love this quote, I guess that's the cool thing about making accusations of racism. The burden of proof lies with the accused and never the claimant. Now, one deaths in custody researcher, that's a guy named Davis Biles, provided evidence to the Deaths in Custody Royal Commission 30 years ago, which proved unequivocally that Aboriginal people were slightly less likely to die in prison or police custody than non-Aboriginal people. That truth has never been uttered from the lips of many Aboriginal activists, let alone Thorpe herself. You see, that would interfere with the virtue signalling. It appears that virtue signalling without action is actually rife in our nation. It's clearly more prevalent than racism, misogyny, Islamophobia, transphobia, homophobia, or any other slur the radical left activists will hurl your way. You see, they have no interest in fixing the ills they claim burden our society. It's just their way of keeping the business of being perpetually outraged funded at your expense.